Hello and welcome to Clay to Canopy, the show where I attempt to make just about everything from the ground up. Today I'm going to be taking on two-part plaster molds for slip casting ceramics. So come on, let's do this. Would be great to add a centerpiece to my Woodland Feast, since the idea of this whole Woodland Feast is that woodland creatures came together to have this feast. I think I want a centerpiece that is going to involve some sort of fruit. I am also going to be teaching my high school students to make two-part slip cast molds, so I thought it was a good time to go ahead and make this video. Today is December 4th and my Woodland Feast is not even going to get rolling until sometime in the new year, but molds take quite a while to set up before they can be ready to go, and I'm not quite sure what I'm going to end up using as far as fruit goes. I need to get these molds rolling now because I want to give them a good month to dry out, and then I need a bit of cushion room in case it doesn't work out and I end up not using them. Sometimes I make a bunch of things, I work on multiple ideas, and not everything ends up in the final piece. For this video, we're just going to do the two-part plaster making, and then in a later video I will go ahead and do a video of casting those ceramic objects, making the apples or pear or lemon, whatever I end up going with, but this is what I have to work with. If you are a newbie to making two-part molds, I would highly recommend using objects that are not organic, that are man-made out of plastic or glass. You can buy plastic fruit, and I have a bunch of plastic fruit and vegetables that I give to my students to use. Those objects were already cast out of a mold. If it's a really cheap product, it's going to already have casting line of where it came out of the mold because they don't do much to clean those things up. That's usually what I go with for beginning class. That way it gives you a good idea of just the process itself. I did not do that. I have some fruit that I purchased from the grocery store, and I have some lemons from my tree. They are completely oddball shaped. These are ceramic apples that I have made previously. I have no idea, because this is well over 10 years ago, how I went about doing this. I believe I did top and bottom with the sprue here, and that's the method I think was done. So I'm going to roll with that. That mold I have long since gotten rid of when I downsized, and now here I am needing a fruit mold. The first thing you need to do is inspect your piece that you're going to be casting. Find any problem areas. For this piece of fruit, I'm going to be getting rid of the majority of this stem, as I want to cast in this direction and have a mold coming from here and here. Once I'm trying to remove the ceramic object out of the mold, this is going to become a problem that's not going to want to release from me. So the first thing I'm going to do is remove my stems, and I'm going to do the same with the apple. In the mold world, we talk a lot about undercuts. If I were to cast this and divide my mold in this direction in half, then this little dimple here in the bottom of my apple would be known as an undercut. What that means is that if this was submerged in plaster down here when we do the cast, this bit is going to be stuck inside the plaster and I won't be able to remove it, and that's what's called an undercut. So if you have an oddball object and you're going to be casting it in a certain way where you end up with undercuts, I'd like to take a bit of clay, pump it in there, and fill it in so that it becomes flush and you no longer have that undercut. Because of the way I'm going to be casting this, where I'm going to be casting it down in here, I will not have an undercut situation because the mold itself will release from the top and from the bottom, and since it can come vertically up this way, it will not get stuck anywhere in here. If you're dealing with a plastic object, you'll very easily be able to tell all of those areas will have been filled in, or you may see an object that has different fragmented lines, meaning it was cast in multiple forms. So if the object itself is plastic and it has lines going in multiple directions, and you see more than just a half divided line, that means it was a multi-part mold. And you probably don't want to take on that object. You want something that's going to be fairly symmetrical and has only one cast line. In the case of this popcorn bucket, this was definitely cast in multiple parts. You can see that the top half of the ears have this dividing line right here, and you can see that line going all the way through, but it stops right here at the end. So this was made as two separate parts, one part here, one part here, and then this bottom part was a separate cast line. So yes, this was made in multiple parts, but if I was to make this out of a ceramic object and I wanted it in one go, this would be a three-part mold. one mold submerged here at the bottom. That would be one piece of the mold. And then there would also be a broken off two halves this way. So there would be a block of plaster down here with a void for the pants part of this mold. And then the top half would come apart here, you know, one here and one here. The next step is I need to figure out my build line. If this is a plastic object, then you already have a dividing line. Go ahead and take a marker and highlight where that seam line, where that cast line was, just to make it prominent so that you have something to look at. In the case of these apples, I want to inspect where the high point is. So I want to pick my highest point, and that is where I'm going to go. So as I turn this, I'm looking to see where does the curve happen. I want to pick the highest peak point to where the curve just slightly tapers off. As you're going along, this line might not be 100% in half. Just follow along and make sure that you're catching anything that would be considered an undercut, which would be anything beyond that peak point. So that's going to work out good for me for this apple. And you know, it's always trial and error with these things. It's an organic object. It might not work out. I might have to, you know, abandon it. That's why I have two different apples. Maybe the other one requires 3 parts instead of 2 parts. And I'm going to do the same thing with the rest of my fruit. Now this guy is going to be a little bit trickier. Looking for those high points. Whatever you do not go back and eat your fruit after you've markered it up and submerged it in plaster. This is a I'm not going to eat the fruit after kind of deal. So if you're using whatever you're using, it's going to be done for after you mold make. It is not safe to eat after. I've said it out loud. Don't try and come for me otherwise. Hopefully the bumpiness of this will be okay. You want to try and pick a really smooth type of fruit. You know, you don't want a pineapple. The next thing I have here are known as cuddle boards. I have made these by taking some pieces of melamine or coated shelving. You can buy coated shelving at different widths. These cuddle boards that I made are adjustable. To make them adjustable, I screwed a little extra strip on the end here of my cuddle board. And what that's going to do is provide somewhere for a clamp to sit up against, which means I can then stack these next to each other, adjust them, pop on a clamp, and I have an adjustable spacing. I like working with the adjustables because it reduces me from having to have so many in here, but the adjustables do require you to have clamps. I have plenty of clamps here, but anytime you're in education and it's art related funds, we try to keep it at a minimum, and clamps are ridiculously expensive. So what I have done is pre-cut some of these to specific box sizes that work really well with the fruit that I give them, and in that case it is a fixed box. It's not adjustable, but I can just go ahead and assemble it with some screws. To take it apart, I just unscrew the box because it's much cheaper to have a drill and some screws. I can get a box of screws that cost me $5 rather than each mold is going to need at least 4 clamps, and one clamp is about $20 a clamp. That can be very costly if you are trying to do this for a classroom setting. Now, if you are at home and you are just messing around, you can also try to find yourself some symmetrical plastic containers. Nothing tapered. You want the sides to be square all around or round, either way, but it's nothing tapering, because you're going to be popping this mold out and flipping it over. So whatever that shape is needs to be able to be inverted over and pour the second half on. And if you have a tapered form, it's not going to really work out. The other thing I have is some leftover clay. Now this is my bad batch of clay. As I was making other objects for my last environment, and probably some of this is scrap left over from this environment, I always tend to save my scrap clay that I know I'm not going to re-wedge and use for ceramic purposes, but for mold making purposes. And so that's what this stuff is. It's just some really old bits of what looks like Dave's porcelain. And porcelain is not a necessity for mold making, but the more grog you have in your clay, the more those bits are going to show up. I prefer to have as smooth as I can. You're only using this to sink your piece in, but I just find it much easier to smooth the objects when it is already working with a smooth clay. The other thing I try to avoid is using a colored clay. Now you most certainly can use a red clay or a black, brown, whatever clay, but I try to use a light colored clay because I don't like getting the oxide mixed into my plaster. This is going to get submerged into plaster, and we're going to be pouring plaster on top of this piece. But to get me going, I need to have it set up with a base. So I'm going to get this sunk into a bunch of clay. A good plaster mold, you want to have at least 2 inches of space all around your object so that you have enough plaster to absorb the water out of the slip liquid clay. And it's basically just watered down liquid clay with some other elements to help it from not coagulating. The purpose of the plaster is to absorb all the excess water. You want to make sure that you have enough plaster around your object so you can continue to cast and cast and cast without having to wait for that mold to dry out. There's a fine line between the spacing you have and it's too heavy to pick up kind of deal. So I say when you're doing an object about this size, 2 to 3 inches is okay all around the piece, and you definitely want to make sure you have at least 2 inches of room above the piece. And then I also need room for 2 inches of space below it because I'm going to be flipping this over. So you want to make sure that whatever board you're using, that you've got at least a good 4 inches above the object. If it's a larger object and you'll be using a lot more clay, then of course you want to bulk up your sides even more, make them a little bit thicker depending on the size of your object. I'm going to get myself a 2-inch thick block using all this scrap junk clay, and it doesn't have to be perfect at this point. Would have been helpful if I busted out some clay tools. If you are not using scrap and you are using, a solid brick, you can just go ahead and cut half of it, smack the chunk down, and move on to this next step. But if you are trying to reserve some scraps, then you're going to be doing it this way where you're piling on bits. I'm going to take a rolling pin and go over this with a rolling pin so that I can smooth it out a bit more. As long as I have enough for my line to get buried, it doesn't matter if I'm under the 2 inches when it comes to the clay slab part of it. I just need to make sure I have enough of a slab to build up to my line. So I'm almost there. That's going to be good for me. I'm going to go ahead and smooth out this first surface using a rib. I think what I'm going to do here is trim this up a bit. So I'm just going to take a ruler, give myself a bit of a clean cut. I don't need to worry about any kind of air bubbles. I'm not playing by any kind of ceramic rule as far as that goes right now. All this clay right here is going to get thrown in the trash when I'm done. It's going to come into contact with the plaster, and you do not want plaster mixed into your clay when it comes to firing, because bad things will happen. This is not going in the kiln. I'm going to take my object and I am going to plop it down here, and I am going to eyeball an outline using my fettling knife around about where this is going to go. And then I'm going to hollow that out till I hit the bottom. Just using a large ribbon tool. You can use a smaller ribbon tool or a loop tool, whichever you'd like to call it. It's called both. Now my object is rounded. It's going to taper under. I don't necessarily have to hog out all of it, but I do want to pay attention to make sure I get enough out, and I don't want to destroy this half by forcing it in here. So if I don't take out enough, I may ruin or damage this, and if I get a blemish on it, when I go to do the other side, it's going to be deformed, and I don't want to deform my apple or your fruit or whatever it is you're casting. The goal is to get to my line. So I've got this nice and sunk to where my line is. I want to now come in and build up against my line. Use the back end of my fettling knife, come in, and if I don't have enough there, I have to just try and get it sunk in. And I want a nice clean connection here, so I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I'm pushing a little bit of that clay up against the piece of fruit so that I get a good seal on there. See that? I mean, you want a really good seal. You can see over here I got a gap on the back end, so I'm using my fettling knife to get rid of that gap and get it nice and close over here on the side. This is the part that can take an age. The more you fiddle with this part, the more perfect your mold will be, the better your casting will be. You want to take your time and don't do this part in a rush, because anything you do here to the clay and to this object is going to translate to the mold. It's really important to spend the time to clean up your mold and make a really good mold in the first place, so that when it comes to casting your objects out of clay, there's a lot less cleanup to do once it's turned into a clay object. If you leave a mistake here in the mold, yes, you can clean up the clay object, but for every clay object you make, you have to keep cleaning up every single one of those pieces. To me, it's more time efficient to spend the time to do a good job with your mold initially, so that you don't have to do much cleanup later on. You can just crank out your objects, throw them in the kiln, and you're good to go. It is okay to take small bits of clay if you are missing your line and smack it in there. Just try and smooth your surface. And you want to try and keep the overall surface flat as you possibly can, because you're going to be pouring plaster on top of it. And you want this to be an even surface where the piece is submerged into its half line and you don't have this like mountain forming or a divot coming out. I cannot find my favoriteest little tool, which is a rubber tip piece. Looks sort of like this. This is a bleeder tip. I think it's Elf. So this is a makeup tip, but they make a ceramic version of this, and it's really great having this rubber tip to come in and do your cleaning up. If you don't have one of these, then you can just go ahead and use your fettling knife, but this gives you a nice clean line. I don't know what it's called. Don't ask me. I don't wear makeup, obviously. Someday, maybe. Maybe I'll surprise you. Anyhow, you can use that to clean up your line. I think I'm pretty happy with where this line is. The next thing I'm going to need to do is add a sprue. A sprue is an area that is basically going to become a void in the mold. So I'm going to plug a funnel looking thing of clay here. What will happen is I'll end up with a hole running through my mold, and that'll be the area for me to pour in my liquid slip. Now, I did not need to do this in a previous video when I made the dish mold because I was pouring directly into an open area. It was just a one-shot mold. Because this is a two-part mold and it's going to be fully encased in plaster, I do need to add a sprue. I'm just going to take a chunk of clay, roll a tapered coil. I want to make sure that it is large enough for me to pour the liquid slip through, but I also want to make sure that it is not so large that I'm going to have too big of an area to clean up later. Because this is going to be a giant gaping hole on the side of my piece, I'm going to have to take some extra slip that is hardened over and plug over it to make it look seamless. And that's what's happened here with this apple. You can tell just barely there's a bit of a flat here. You want to kind of put it in a flat area that's easy to clean up. So I'm picking this little section because it looks the flattest. I'm making the whole thing first, and then I'm going to cut it in half. I don't need the other half. I just visually, it's easier to just see it, cut it in half, and then only attach the half that you need. And then I want this nice and flat, and I don't want this coming off on me. I'm going to just go ahead and blend that down. I'm going to blend a little bit of it onto the apple. I want to pop in some keyholes, and what a keyhole is going to be just where I align my mold when I have the two halves out of plaster. So I'm going to take the back end of my fettling knife and I'm just going to dig a bit of a shallow, about 1/4 inch down, and I'm going to do that in, well, I guess 3 spots. No, we'll do 4 spots. 3, 4, and it is good to offset these slightly. If they're too symmetrical with each other, you won't know where it goes. And so I don't want it too deep. It could shear off the plaster. I have a damp sponge, and I'm just gonna clean off my apple. I also get rid of any little bits that might be on the surface of my clay. So I'm gonna get my boards up. And to use these adjustable boards, I want the bit with the double end lined up at one of the edges, and the overage, the extra part that doesn't have that bit, goes against that section. And you have your other double bit here and your overage there, and so on, because what happens is you grab your clamp and you get your clamp on over here, and that pulls it together. I'm gonna have to do a little bit of adjusting because I didn't quite make my square perfect. So I have some gapping going on. You can see the gapping and the spacing between there. I need to fill that in. And the other thing I need to do is roll a very small coil and pump it up through the side seams, because anywhere that these joints meet is a potential place that plaster could plow out. When I go to do the pour, I could end up having a plaster mess. It might be too hard for you to see on camera with my hands in this box, but you really want to make sure you get a good tight seal all around this area. And because this is not anywhere near your pattern, the object that you're casting is what we call your pattern. This side seam is not anywhere near your pattern. You don't have to worry too much if it's a little bit bulky or doesn't look that great around the edges. It's not going to interfere with the object that you're casting. After I get a good seam line there, I will come in and pop a coil up through the seam here. I am almost ready to pour my plaster. My sides are good and sealed all around the base and up through the side seams. Now the very last thing I have to do is to put some mold release on my object. For the most part, you don't really need to do this for the clay, but you need to do it for your object. And I just have some glycerin. You could use the mold release that they sell or some dish soap. I'm just going to brush this on over my object. Give it a few minutes to harden over and dry so that you can be sure you have a good coat. I usually coat 2 or 3 times just to make sure that they have a good seal. That's really important when it comes to the plaster part of this. For the main part of the object, you want to just make sure you get a couple good coats on there and you're good to go. For my plaster, I'm going to be using #1 Pottery plaster. This is designed to be strong enough to do ceramic casting, but also porous enough to suck out the excess water when it comes time to do your pouring. You're going to need a bucket that you can basically throw away because you don't want any kind of plaster going down your sink. So what I do is I fill up a 5-gallon bucket halfway with water. Any tools or the buckets that have been hit with plaster, including my hands, I wash them in that bucket. The plaster will settle to the bottom and then let the bucket harden. So this part of it, I have a very scientific method. I basically eyeball. I look in there and I go, okay, this container will roughly fit. I need 2 inches of plaster above this. I pour some water in that looks like it's going to be about that, and then I will be adding plaster, which is going to increase in volume. Plaster is not a 1-for-1. It's not going to double in volume, but it will increase in volume just slightly. I would say probably about 1/3 more of what you're going to get. I'm just eyeballing how much water I think I need. If you want to do it in some other scientific method, go for it, but I don't have that kind of time. Okay, I'm going to do this on the floor. And I have thrown on a pair of gloves because this is that plaster that does not like me so much. It burns my hands. I won't even feel it during this session. I end up feeling it the next day. So you could go ahead and measure plaster and water and deal with measuring. I don't measure. What I do is I start pouring plaster in until I see a mountain form that no longer wants to get absorbed into the water. And when the mountain stays on top and doesn't go into the water anymore, I usually throw on just a bit more plaster for good measure and I'm good to go. Always keep your plaster away from the water. You want to make sure you keep it dry. And if you do have a sensitivity to materials, you may also wear a mask. Hello, Bubba. Yeah, this is not going to be one you get to play with, honey. I'm sorry. I know, baby girl. You love water, but this is not a play bucket. No. Come on, baby. Bubba? Sweetheart. I can't have you play with this plaster. I'm sorry. Okay. Anytime there is a bucket of water, this one comes running. I'm just kind of shaking it around, getting all the plaster in there. I'm not disturbing the water or doing any mixing. I'm just shaking in my plaster. Alright, you can see I'm starting to hit a maxing point where it's stopping taking any more plaster. That's the mountain I'm talking about. So because of the shape of this bucket, I probably want about a 3 by 3 inch mountain that doesn't go anywhere. You see my mountain keeps eroding. That means that the water is still taking it, so keep going till it doesn't erode anymore. And I'm just going to throw in this last bit for good measure. That's about where you want it to be on a normal day, a normal California day. What that means is 80 degrees-ish out, you're good to go here. If it is rainy, cloudy, or anything under 80 degrees, you want to throw in a little bit more for good measure because it will tend to be a little bit slower set when you are dealing with anything that's in the cold. I had to start off with my stick, but usually I end up throwing my hand in. Do not throw your hand into this plaster unless you are wearing gloves, because this stuff will burn and you won't know it until the next day. Alright, we are almost set. I have almost no lumps, no peanut. Alright, when you're sure your lumps are gone and you have it fairly thick, you're good to start pouring. You'll want to have a pour buddy, especially if you are my student. If you are home trying to do this on your own, still try and find yourself a buddy who is going to have a chunk of clay hanging around and waiting. Any kind of leak around the outside of the mold, they take that chunk of clay and smack it around wherever the plaster is leaking to stop the leak from happening. I will probably yell for Sarah if I start having a leak. But for now, we're ready to go on the pour. So I'm just going to very slowly start pouring against the side, trying not to get to too much splashing happening. And I'm going slow because I want to make sure that I'm checking for leaks. Of course, I can't see a leak now beyond this camera. And then I want to make sure that I get at least 2 inches above my form here. So I have to hope that I mixed enough plaster to be at least 2 inches above that apple. And I seem to be. I could have put in a marker line. This was a little too lumpy. I should not have left it lumpy. Alright, I'm going to bang on my table to get rid of some of these bubbles. and hope that I didn't bust a leak. Looks okay. And I'm gonna let this set up. Now I have this extra plaster. This needs to go into that junk bucket of plaster so that I can wash out my bucket and use it again. All right, so this is gonna take, if this is out in the sun, maybe an hour to set. If it is not out in the sun, a couple hours to set. Really depends on how well you did the mixing. It is set enough for my liking for me to be able to pull this thing apart. You wanna make sure that it's firm. I'm gonna go ahead and unmold. All right, so I gotta clean up my cottle boards and give them a quick sponge down. I want to leave my piece of fruit in and sprue in. The rest of it is gonna go. So I'm gonna just gently try and flip this over. Ah, smells like an apple. And now I only have a half a sprue, so I have to mimic the other side of that, and if I was smart, I would have saved the half that I cut off, but I did not because I wasn't thinking clearly, obviously. So I'm gonna go ahead and build up the other half of the sprue very quickly. Now I do have some other fruit to mold. I want to hang on to it so I can use this base for my other fruit. I will have to do a little zhuzhing up. I do want to make sure that I can get a release, so I'm just gently gonna lift it. Check it, looks good, pop it back in so I can do the other half. And you can always tell when I have just had lunch because I'm functioning in like a halfway mode. At this point, if I was not happy with the way that this plaster looks, it's soft enough to grab my fettling knife and carve away to get rid of those extra bits that happened along the side edges and give myself a nice smooth edge. And of course I could very easily get carried away, chunking off stuff. Whatever you do though, stay the heck away from the patterned area because you do not want to disturb anything that's happening up close by your object. This plaster is still super wet, so I really don't want to go pouring my other half just quite yet. I want this to dry out. If it is too wet, your second half may stick to it. You'll have a solid mold that you cannot unmold, and that will be no bueno. So I am going to clean off my apple, and then we are going to be back to applying my mold release onto this plaster. The plaster does need to dry a bit more before I go ahead and do that, but I don't want to wait too long because I don't want my apple to start rotting. This plaster, when it started to set, it kicked up some heat. There's a chemical reaction, the plaster gets really hot, and then at that point it's also heating up my apple. The first thing I did when I popped this top off is I could smell that apple. It smelled like it was roasting the apple. You got a time limit when you're dealing with natural fruit. Unmolding it while it's partially set, it'll help dry it faster. Some air can get at it. Since I have some other fruit to get going on while this is drying over in the sun, I will still use the cottle boards and smack this thing back on and cast the other apple. The other quick thing, your edges on the back side of the mold, you might want to clean it up while it's soft. If you're pouring and you leave this sharp edge, bits of that plaster can break off into your casting and you don't want that. While it's still soft, I like to carve what the mold is. Sometimes the date, these molds do eventually wear out. A date might be helpful so that you can gauge when you made the thing and when you might need to like remake the mold or replace it. If you are one of my students, I would like for you to carve your name in it, and then you can also carve apple or whatever fruit or vegetable you are working with. This was a honey crisp, but I don't want to go carving all of that into it. This is gonna matter when I have two apple molds out and they both look exactly the same and I have no idea which one goes with which. So I'm gonna carry on with this process for the remainder of the molds. I still have that second apple and the pear, and then I am going to crank out another 3 molds with the lemons, and hopefully that will get me to where I need to be for the Woodland Feast centerpiece. I have switched it up to using this little bit of Murphy soap that I have. I do need to make a run and get some more. I just don't trust the glycerin. It's a really damp day here and the plaster is set, but it's way too damp for my liking. And I know Murphy soap works like a charm, and I have coated the other apple molds with 2 coats of the Murphy soap. All right, so I'm gonna replace my sprue and get me going. Make sure I refill my void and then blend up against my apple. Now the second half should be much, much easier because the only clay I need to worry about is my sprue and sealing my edges inside the cottle boards. I flipped over the plaster. I got rid of the slab of clay that this was sitting on. We're looking at the butt of the apple that was sitting in the clay when I did the other half. It's now upside down and we're casting the opposite side. I have a bit of gapping. I'm gonna go ahead and just roll some coil and just fill in my side edges and up through my seam line. All right, I think we're good to go. Ready to pour in that plaster layer. Righty, here we go. It has been a long while. I got ridiculously busy and should have opened these molds a long time ago. Hopefully the fruit is not rotted away. Ugh! And of course the fruit started to rot. Gross. Do not be like me. Unmold your stuff in time. Alright, well, the mold's okay. Looks okay. So this needs to continue to dry for at least another month before I can use it for slip casting, which is the liquid stuff. If I let this dry in the sun for a couple weeks though, I can use it as a press mold. Alright, I'm gonna go ahead and open up the other molds. Yay! Looks like the apples held up a lot better. Alright y'all, I was trying to give these molds some time to dry so that I could get a pressing in before I needed to complete this video, but it's not gonna happen. So I'm gonna have to do this in 2 parts. I will make a second video pouring the objects, making the ceramic apples and pears for the centerpieces of the Woodland Feast. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, share, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, and stick around to watch the rest of this Woodland Feast come together. But it is off-centered and driving me bonkers. There you go. You get to look at the man a little more. Bubba man. Like doing this, let me sidestep to be centered in the camera. Alright, much better. Okay, someone's having some band practice and hope I don't get a copyright strike for that noise, but sounds like Rhode Island. Alrighty. And my head is cut off.